So it turns out this accident wasn't defined by a single crack or a sudden overload at rotation. The NTSB published its latest update on the crash of UPS Flight 2976 just days ago, and it doesn't just tell us what broke, it tells us where the failure really started and why this MD-11 was already living on borrowed time before it ever reached V1. If you haven't watched the earlier videos on this accident, I recommend starting there first. The links are in the description. Those cover the timeline, the video evidence, and the basic sequence. This update fills in the missing mechanical why. The key takeaway is this: we're not just talking about a cracked lug anymore. We're talking about a bearing assembly that had quietly lost its structural integrity long before takeoff. And once you understand that, the rest of this accident stops being mysterious. I'm William. Welcome to Black Box Analyst. And if it's your first time here, my channel breaks down these accidents down step by step and fact by fact. So consider subscribing if that's useful to you. Now let's come to the update. The January update confirms several things we already suspected. The left engine separated immediately after rotation. A fire ignited near the left pylon wing attachment area. And the sequence happened so fast that the crew never had meaningful options. All of that lines up with what we've seen on video and in earlier data. Where this update really adds value is inside the pylon. The NTSB's focus is now squarely on the pylon aft mount bulkhead assembly. That assembly is what ties the engine to the wing structure, and it's built around three critical elements. You have the forward and aft lugs, which most people are familiar with, and between them, you have a single spherical bearing assembly, which allows controlled movement as the wing flexes. Inside that bearing is a bearing race, which is supposed to be one continuous intact ring. Here's the key. So it turns out that detail from the materials lab, the bearing race was not intact. It had fractured into forward and aft portions. More importantly, the fracture wasn't sudden. The lab found fatigue cracking that initiated on the interior surface of the race and propagated around essentially the entire circumference, right at a design feature known as the recess groove. That detail matters a lot. A cracked lug is serious, but it's still a localized failure. You can imagine a single piece of metal reaching its limit and breaking. A bearing race that's cracked around most of its circumference is something else entirely. That means the joint had already lost its ability to share load evenly. By the time the airplane rotated, that bearing was no longer behaving as a single, coherent structure. So instead of the lugs seeing smooth, centered loads, they were seeing uneven, impulsive loads. At that point, the lugs weren't the initiators anymore, they were the victims. This update effectively moves the failure upstream. The bearing failed first, the lugs paid the price. And once that bearing race let go under peak loads, the outcome was almost inevitable. To understand why this bearing mattered so much, we need to talk briefly about something people notice but don't always think about: engine movement. If you've ever watched a wide body take off from the cabin or from the ramp, you've seen the engines move. They wiggle. That's not a defect, that's by design. Engine pylons are not rigid structures, and they're not supposed to be. Wings flex in flight, they bend under load. If the engine were bolted on rigidly, every bump, every gust, every wing deflection would transmit shock loads straight into the structure. That would cause damage very quickly. So engineers design pylons to allow controlled movement. That movement is handled by bearings, bushings, and lubrication. The spherical bearing in the aft mount is a big part of that system. Its job is to let the engine move just enough to stay aligned with the wing while keeping the load centered and smooth. When everything is healthy, the load path is simple. Wing load goes into the bearing spreads it evenly, then the lugs carry it into the structure. It's smooth, it's predictable. Now here's where it goes wrong. When there's excessive play in that bearing, or when the bearing race is internally cracked, the load path changes. Loads stop being smooth and start becoming spiky. Instead of being distributed across the whole bearing surface, they get concentrated along cracked edges and discontinuities. Think of it this way. Instead of the load flowing through a wide, smooth surface, it's now jumping across broken geometry. That turns the bearing from a load distributor into a stress concentrator. So the lugs start seeing forces they were never meant to see. Not because the airplane suddenly did something extreme, but because the joint feeding those loads is no longer doing its job. That's why this update is so important. It explains why you can look at the lugs afterward and say, they failed. Yes, they did, but they failed after the bearing race had already lost its integrity. This wasn't an engine failure, it wasn't a thrust issue, it wasn't a pilot technique issue. This was a load path failure, and once that path broke down, the rest followed in sequence. Now that we understand where the failure lived, the next question is the obvious one. Why did this bearing race crack in the first place? The materials lab gives us a very specific answer, and it's not vague or speculative. The fatigue cracking initiated at the edge of the design recess groove on the interior surface of the bearing race. That groove is a geometric feature. It's part of the design, and it sits exactly where stress and micromovement concentrate during normal engine motion. This wasn't a one-time overload. The fracture surface tells that story clearly. About 3/4 of the bearing race failed by fatigue, with the remaining portion failing by final overstress. In other words, the bearing spent a long time getting weaker, and then it finally gave up when the loads peaked. That distinction matters. From the outside, this accident looks instantaneous. The engine separates right at rotation. The fire ignites. The airplane never really climbs. But the lab results tell us that the real failure unfolded over years, not seconds. The bearing race was quietly accumulating damage, cycle after cycle, until there was no margin left. This is also why the failure propagation looks so dramatic on video. Once the cracked bearing race reached its limit, the remaining intact material couldn't carry the load anymore. The final break happens quickly because all the stored stress gets released at once. Investigators also noted the presence of remnant grease-like material inside the bearing assembly. That's worth mentioning because people often jump to lubrication questions. Yes, the bearing was lubricated. But lubrication doesn't cancel fatigue if the geometry and loading environment create a crack starter. Grease reduces friction. It doesn't erase stress concentration. So this wasn't neglect, it wasn't dryness. It was a design feature interacting with long-term loading in a way that turned into a hidden fatigue mechanism. And once you see that, the accident stops being mysterious. It becomes mechanical. Anytime a report mentions a manufacturer service letter, people immediately jump to conclusions. So let's slow this down and keep it factual. The NTSB update points directly to Boeing Service Letter MD-11 SL54104A issued in 2011. That letter documented 4 previously reported spherical bearing race failures on 3 different airplanes. And here's the important part. Every one of those failures initiated at the same design recess groove we're talking about here. So yes, the failure mode was known, but what matters is how it was understood. The service letter described a way to detect failed bearings visually. When a bearing race fractures completely, the 2 pieces can migrate slightly forward or aft and become visible relative to the lug surfaces. Inspectors were instructed to look for that migration during scheduled, general, and detailed visual inspections, not during routine walkarounds. Here's the uncomfortable truth that this update makes clear. A bearing race can be deep into fatigue cracking and still look perfectly normal externally. Until the race actually separates enough to migrate, there may be nothing visible to see. That means a purely visual inspection strategy is inherently limited. It can catch failures after they fully develop, but it's not designed to detect internal cracking before separation. The service letter also discussed a new configuration bearing assembly that eliminated the groove altogether. That's significant because it shows the design concern was recognized. But the installation of that newer bearing was recommended, not mandated. And importantly, the older bearing design was not prohibited as a replacement option at the time. This is where it's important to be precise with language. The update does not say Boeing ignored the problem. It does not say inspectors missed something obvious. What it shows is that the system treated this failure mode as benign, not a safety of flight issue based on previous assumptions. Those assumptions did not hold up under the conditions of this accident. That's not blame, that's evolution. Aviation safety moves forward when real-world events challenge what we thought we understood. With the structural picture clear, the final step is to see whether the airplane data agrees with the story. And this is one of those rare cases where everything lines up cleanly. The preliminary flight data recorder review shows normal airplane and engine performance right up until roughly 20 seconds before the end of recorded data. At that point, the parameters for the number 1 engine become unreliable, which is exactly what you'd expect if the engine is no longer attached to the airplane. Shortly after that, the number 1 engine fire indication changes from no fire to fire. The throttles for engines 2 and 3 advance, which tells us the crew responded exactly the way you'd expect. They added power. Engine 2 shows minor perturbations consistent with airflow disruption or debris effects. Engine 3 increases and remains steady, but at that point, it's alone. Ground speed holds at roughly 184 knots until the final seconds, which tells us there was no meaningful energy escape. The airplane simply didn't have the thrust to weight margin to climb. This is where it's important to be very clear. None of this points to pilot technique. None of it suggests a missed procedure. This is performance math after a structural separation at rotation. Once the bearing race failed, once the engine departed, and once the second engine was compromised, the outcome was dictated by physics. There was no hidden option left on the table. The broader implication of this update is where things go next. It strongly suggests a reevaluation of whether these spherical bearing race failures can truly be considered non-safety of flight. It raises questions about inspection philosophy, whether visual methods alone are enough for aging fleets, and it increases the likelihood that the grooveless bearing design becomes the standard rather than the option. And that's where I'd leave it. Sometimes the failure that brings an airplane down isn't the big, obvious component. It's the small part that quietly becomes the load path dictator. UPS 2976 wasn't brought down by a single crack. It was brought down by a system that believed a crack like this didn't matter. This update shows us exactly why it did. Let me know what you think in the comments. Was visual only detection ever enough here, or does this accident force a different standard? Fly safe, and I'll see you in the next video.